Good afternoon, I'm Rita Celli. This is Ontario Today. In this hour...
This is not about erasing history. This isn't about rewriting history. This isn't about revisionist history. This is about the fullness of our history. Walking into a building named after somebody who is quite literally responsible for the genocide of Indigenous peoples, that's dark.
It's completely silly and frivolous. John A. Macdonald's contribution to Canada is so immense. When we, in the 21st century, cast judgment on the 19th century, we have to be a lot more humble.
The debate about Sir John A. Macdonald's place in history has been simmering for a long time. A lot more has bubbled up in this year of Canada 150 celebrations, including the suggestion, the move to try to take his name off some public schools in Ontario. All of it boiling away, so blistering this debate that it has drawn in one of the country's most thoughtful voices.
We're not going to get a perfect consensus around this question, but I think we need to understand that if we're going to talk about reconciliation, we really need to move forward in a more positive vein, and continuing to act out of anger or revenge will not contribute to that sense of respect.
Senator Murray Sinclair, our guest for the hour, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he heard years' worth of testimony. He listened and studied and reflected on how Canada could look forward, integrate the past and the future. We'll listen to what he's been thinking about since this debate erupted about the man known as the Father of Confederation, and you are welcome to join the conversation. I know you care. A week or so ago, I called the show Sir John A. Macdonald on trial, and it went all over the place. The teacher who called in, who likes the idea of hitting the delete button. The woman who said she's tired of all the public places named after dead male politicians. The man from the Batchewana Band who said, "When does it stop?" We also all know that this debate does go far deeper than just the status of Sir John A. Macdonald. Maybe Senator Sinclair will get you thinking. Perhaps you have a question for him. This is the toll-free number 1-888-817-8995. Senator Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is our guest in this hour of Ontario Today. Who was in fact the Chief Commissioner for, I think the full title was the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Recommendations were tabled in 2015. The Honourable Justice Sinclair is in our studio in Winnipeg. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. And it's former justice, incidentally. I retired before I went to the Senate.
Right. You can't do both, can you? That would be really impressive. This debate about Sir John A. Macdonald, not a surprise to you, I guess, that there was going to be maybe a more public reckoning one day. What have you been reflecting on?
Well, I was asked to comment upon it a number of times and declined to participate in the debate, mainly because I found it to be distracting from the real direction I think we needed to go into, which was to find a way to create a sense of balance to the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But I did so fully aware of the fact that Sir John A. Macdonald is a person in our history, in this country, whose reputation and whose status in the eyes of many Canadians far exceeds what he's entitled to. And what I said, in fact, was that I well understand the negative feelings that people have about John A. Macdonald and about what he's done. I've analyzed the debates on both sides, and what I've said is that there are people on both sides who take it to an extreme. On the negative side, of course, are those who say that we should remove every single honor that's ever been bestowed upon him. We should never recognize him as anyone who's contributed anything of positive significance to this country. And on the other side, there are those who say that he was merely reflective of his times and he did what he could, and he was a true historical figure whom we should honor constantly, and neither side of those is really, neither side of those positions is really quite accurate.
Yeah, how do you see it?
Well, from the negative side, there's no question that he was a person who was a racist. He was a man of a racist time in our history. He was fundamentally a colonizer, but many people say he was merely reflective of the racist views that were going on at the time. And in reality, he was far more racist than the rest of society was. He was a man who believed that Canada should be an Aryan nation. Now, that's his term that he used in debates in Parliament. He believed that Canada should be populated by white, middle-class European people, and that people of color should not be allowed into the country if they're coming from foreign jurisdictions, and that those who were of color in this country already, the Indigenous people, should be forced to assimilate and ultimately die out.
But when you talk about the white country, I mean, Laurier used that language, as Wilfrid Laurier did as well. Yes, I mean, so
that's right. And the reality is that both of those figures and others who used language like that were opposed by a very significant population of other Canadians who said that is not what this country is all about. And so people who point only to that, while they're correct that he said it, need to take into account that does not mean, or that in fact it means that he wasn't really reflective of the majority of Canadians at the time. Now, the majority of Canadians at the time were quite racist towards Indigenous people. I don't think there's any question of that, but they weren't to the severity and to the extent that he was.
So on the other side, maybe we should linger there. So you're an Indigenous man yourself.
Yeah.
When you just the human being, you read these words, savages who could read and write. I mean, is there a part of you that is angry? Because it would seem quite justifiable to most reasonable people. And that anger, there's something cathartic and maybe capturing a moment that has, people feel like has slipped away from them, and this is the moment to have it.
Oh, there's no question, but that it really ticks you off, and it really does make you angry that people like that are able to gain the power of the office that they did and use it for the purpose that they did, and it makes you angry that a society, that a nation would allow itself to be used in that way, would allow itself to put those kinds of people in power. That's much of what is being said today about what's going on south of us in the United States. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that if you just dwell on the anger, if you live in that anger, then it does something to you, and it becomes unhealthy, and it becomes an issue that you can't get past. And that doesn't mean that you have to get over it. What it means is that you have to come to terms with it in a more positive way than simply trying to focus all of your energy on undoing what has already been done.
So I want to ask you about this, because many of the discussions, when I host debates for lunch hour, and in the last year in particular, a lot of people, intellectual, activists, Indigenous people, very smart, the conversation has become more in a broader sense. I think it's always happened in certain communities. This idea of, if Canada was a nation, anything that legitimizes Canada is wrong. What do you hear in that? Is that going down a path that concerns you or not? And I ask you this because you sit in the House of Parliament, right? So maybe you accept that construct in a different way than others who are also leaders in the community don't.
Well, there are many ways by which people come to that position, and I think some of those ways need to be kept in mind. Some people come from a position of oppression, from a history of oppression, from a sense of victimization about this history that leads them to speak the way that they do. And some people come from a position of having felt or feeling deceived by what they've been educated to believe, and some come to it from a position of shame. And so there's no one means by which people come to that position of saying that we have to do something about it and we have to fix this before we can move on. But and I think in reality that we probably need to do something about that. And in the case of Sir John A., for example, my suggestion has been that rather than spend all of our times arguing about whether or not all statues should be coming down and all names should be taken off of buildings and he should come off of the $10 bill and he should be removed as a hero of Canada from all of our literature, I think it makes more sense to me for us to actually put his racism into the context of his life so that people who read about him will read about what he truly was and not what those who adore him want us to believe he was.
Is there something different about schools, I wonder? Because that's a nuance here in Ontario. It was a teachers' federation. Something about the fact that these houses of learning and that he was involved, had a significant hand in creating a residential school system, that's more an offense than, let's say, I don't know, in a government building.
Well, first of all, I come from the perspective of not quite understanding and appreciating why we have to put names on buildings, why we have to put names on mountains or put names on rivers or put names on roads. It's really quite a bizarre way of approaching things, and so I don't feel particularly attached to names being put on buildings or on anything else for that matter.
What would you prefer? Let me ask you, because again, especially in the last few weeks with Charlottesville, and we've had a number of debates with the audience here about taking down statues, keeping them, adding plaques. What would you do in the future? Why just guys on horses? What would you prefer?
Well, I think we should be honoring events. I think we should be honoring events by the name by which we know the events or by the event itself. I think we should be honoring locations. I think we certainly should be using the opportunity when we designate rivers and landmarks as indicators of where it is that you're at, as an indicator of what it is that it represents in historical terms, so that the Rocky Mountains are named not after a guy named Rocky. They're named because they are rocky. They are, and they should be descriptive. They should be defining the terrain.
What does your name mean?
After their.
What does your name mean? I was reading about this. What, pictures in the sky or something?
Mizzenagijik.
Yeah.
It's actually a teaching. The spirit name that I was given is Mizzenagijik, which is a spirit who is sent to take care of me, and he brings with him, or with her, or with it, the understanding of what's going on around us. And so the means by which that spirit learns things is to be able to interpret what the Creator shows him in the sky.
Okay.
And so so my spirit name means the one who speaks of pictures in the sky.
It's very nice. It's a nice idea. But I'm wondering, I partly asked because what you're saying is more descriptive. Although I'm going to note there's a new school that's opened up in Ottawa called Vimy Ridge, and I can see where, marking events could also be controversial. But listen, I want to remind our listeners, our guest is Senator Murray Sinclair. You might recognize his voice, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as he indicated off the top, he was drawn into this debate. He'd been asked to comment before on Sir John A. Macdonald, stayed away from it in the last week, is speaking now and pushing everyone, I guess, in different directions to think about what reconciliation, a kind of living reality, what that really looks like, and his proposal of not deconstructing everything that has been done, but looking ahead. I'm not posing any question to the audience today. I often do, but I thought we need to hear this fellow. I'm not going to try and just summarize it all in a minute to start the program. So if you have a question for Senator Sinclair, if he's got you thinking, moving. If you disagree, and certainly if you are an Indigenous person, call us. Where are you moving along the spectrum in this debate? Is it always, do you feel as fervently as you did 3 years ago, 10 years ago? Are you shifting at all? 1-888-817-8995. Theo, you're on the line in Ottawa. Go right ahead.
Hello, and thank you both. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're on the air, Theo. Yes.
Yeah, I called mostly because I heard Mr. Sinclair was going to be on the radio, and I'm a huge fan of his, and I live in Ottawa, so we hear about him a lot. My race isn't important, but I'm not Indigenous, and I'm a small business owner who's essentially dealing in antiques, artifacts, vintage, anything that millennials want to get their hands on. A couple times we've had some pieces through our wall doors that are, I would say, just Indigenous art, but not necessarily the artist. You know what I mean? The subject matter is Indigenous. So we've been getting comments that potentially it's inappropriate to show them or display them because we ourselves, the owners of the establishment, aren't Indigenous, which I'm naive on, and quite frankly, like I don't really know where to turn. They look like awesome, beautiful characterizations of people in their prime doing things that seem perfectly natural. They're not caricatures or cartoons or anything. And I just want to know, from someone who's a bit of an authority, what as a young Canadian I can do. I love Indigenous culture as far as environmental stewardship and holistic medicine, and I want to incorporate it in my life and my children's lives, but I don't want to tread on anyone either.
When you say, so you sell this, do you have a shop or something?
Yeah, we sell vintage of all kinds.
Okay, and the comments, are they from customers? Do you get letters or emails?
Yeah, they're from customers. Never an Indigenous customer yet, and it's another motivating factor to phone in. I was a big fan of New Zealand when I did more research on the fact that they incorporated the Indigenous and the British history into their curriculum, and they intertwined them as a nation. And I didn't get any training or any education in any of my levels of schooling on the Indigenous in my own backyard. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, are we in fear of staying in our own lane, so to speak? I want to learn more. I want to be able to put stuff up that is not from my culture, but from a culture I respect.
Okay,
but I don't want to, ruffle anyone's feathers.
Two quick things, and then we'll hear from Senator Sinclair. Is that one of the kids in the background?
Yeah, that's my youngest. He's very mixed in this conversation.
That's good. That's okay. That's good. I love that. I love when I hear kids on the radio. The other question, because you referred to yourself as a young person, how old are you? Just to give it some context.
I'm in my early 30s.
Okay, Senator Sinclair, how would you? Theo's looking for some wisdom. Actually, is what he's asking for.
Well, actually, there is a lot of wisdom in what he's been saying. So I give him credit for acknowledging and recognizing the issues that he's confronted with and looking for a way to address them in a respectful manner. And I think we don't see enough of that. I think there are lots of people who just kind of plow ahead and reject any suggestion that maybe there's an alternative or a different or a better way. The issue that Theo's comments kind of reflect upon are the issue of cultural appropriation and the issue as well of how do we properly reflect in balance the Indigenous history, the Indigenous perspective of history, the Indigenous presence in history, and Canadian history based upon a European concept of this history. And I think that's a very important question. It's certainly what we talked about in the TRC report, that there needs to be more acknowledgement given to the place that Indigenous people have occupied in this history, and that includes recognizing the contributions that they've made, not just to the land surrenders that have occurred, but also to the culture of this country, and we haven't done enough.
So for someone like Theo, it's very tangible.
It is, and in reality,
can I sell this? Am I insulting someone by selling this?
Cultural appropriation is a hot topic these days, and so let me see if I can run around that a little bit.
Maybe ever the diplomat? Oh, that's your inside voice.
That's right. It's the reason it's a hot topic is because often people do it for personal gain or for personal profit or for the for the purpose of demonizing or making fun of Indigenous people or other cultures for that matter. And we need to recognize that cultural appropriation is not in and of itself the issue. It's cultural misappropriation, I think, that we really should be talking about. When I was younger, I wrote a bit of an article about the fact that as a little kid, the only symbol I ever saw of Indigenous people in the public media was when the television came on in the morning, they would have a test pattern, and in the test pattern you would see an Indian head, head of an Indian man with a war bonnet, and that was the only time I ever saw in any picture form whatsoever in a public way the presence of Indigenous people in this country. And on reflection, I see how inappropriate that was, because it really didn't say anything. It didn't tell us anything. It didn't show anything to anybody in Canada. And what I grew up wondering was, why don't we see around us reflections of our culture? Why don't I see those things that are important to me as an Indigenous kid, as an Indigenous youth? And we never saw it because it had been buried and oppressed. And I think that we need to find space in Canada for reflections of Indigenous culture. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that means that we have to be prepared to share some of that culture with the rest of Canada. And that means that paintings or artwork or books need to be shared, I think. But I'm not talking about plagiarism, incidentally, which is a different thing.
Yes, no.
I'm not talking about people who actually steal the work of other Indigenous artists and use it as their own. I'm talking about people who have learned about that way of expression and want to be able to show it as a Canadian, because that's what it means to them as a Canadian.
We've got about 2 minutes before we break for local news and weather. I want to, so Margot in Toronto, stay on the line. I don't want to rush. Sometimes I'm going to a caller and then stopping at midway, so stay on the line. I'm going to ask you instead, because I know you've thought about this. You posted other figures. You say, well, let's put up Indigenous heroes. Some really interesting ones, but the one I want to ask you before the break, Louis Riel, because that, if there's a Canadian who's been written about, debated still today, it's him. Yeah. So, founder of Manitoba. So some people say he's a lunatic. Other people see him as a fierce defender. I wonder about how you reconcile him, and is that part of why you can also accept the complicated nature of someone like Sir John A. Macdonald?
Yeah, you reconcile him in the same way you reconcile John A. Macdonald. They come with warts and all, and we need to be able to see the warts and the goodness. He has done good things. He was responsible for something positive, but he was also responsible for doing some very strange things, and I think we need to recognize that and talk about that. And unfortunately, I think we've probably talked a lot more about Louis Riel's negative side than we have about Sir John A. Macdonald's negative side in our history.
Although in so many places, Louis Riel, in your home province where you are now, buildings and university campuses. In any case, after the break, you can submit maybe your top two, if you would pick, of who you think should be elevated to a pedestal. Like, people should know more about an Indigenous hero or just a strong figure. Our guest is Senator Murray Sinclair. 1-888-817-8995 if he's got you thinking about Sir John A. and other things, or if you have a direct question for him, give us a call. 1-888-817-8995. We're breaking away now for local news and weather. Back in 90 seconds. You're listening to Ontario Today. I'm Rita Celli.
Walking into a building named after somebody who is quite literally responsible for the genocide of Indigenous peoples, that's dark.
It's completely silly and frivolous. John A. Macdonald's contribution to Canada is immense.
We're not going to get a perfect consensus around this question, but I think we need to understand that if we're going to talk about reconciliation, we really need to move forward in a more positive vein and continuing to act out of anger or revenge will not contribute to that sense of respect.
Our guest is Senator Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on Sir John A. Macdonald and more. What does living, breathing, relevant reconciliation look like? 1-888-817-8995. Our Twitter handle is @CBC Ontario Today. So as promised, Margot in Toronto, go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rita, and it's a privilege to speak with you, Murray Sinclair. My life's work, my whole journey has been in reconciliation, resilience, and restorative justice. And I wanted to share one word. I've written about this. I've spoken with Jody Wilson-Raybould just recently about this, and I'll share this word with you. And the word is Sawbonna, Sawbonna. It means I see you. I see our shared humanity. I learned the word from the man who murdered my father. I'm an immigrant to this country. I'm from Guyana, South America. My dad was murdered in this country. And I guess my journey since I was 16, and I'm almost now 56, has been how to resolve when I suppose I could say no one is to blame. And I don't mean to diminish anything about cultural genocide, and I certainly do not mean to diminish my father's murder. But the word Sawbonna, which speaks to our shared humanity, I believe is an invitation to our TRC conversation. I had a conversation with Desmond Tutu last year about this, and I have followed every step of your journey, and I cry because I think, thank God for you. So Sawbonna is what I'd like to offer when we're all losing our minds and we're all very frustrated and very scared. And I have sat in prisons across this country with many Native young people, and we have shared Sawbonna, and we have cried, and we have shared our humanity. And I believe, Senator Murray Sinclair, that is what you bring to this country, and I thank you for it. So I offer you Sawbonna.
Margot, there's so many
Thank
questions I'd want to ask you. I know that I think you gave your number to our producer. There's so much in between the lines, but Senator Sinclair, is something maybe from Margot's comments?
Well, first of all, Margot, thank you very much for those kind words, and I wish you well in your own journey. I know that that journey is one that's never ending, having lost a brother in the same way that you talked about your father. I want to just reflect for a moment upon a conversation I had one time with a man named Freddie, who was the head of the Reconciliation Center in an African country where genocide had been practiced relatively recently, and as the head of the Reconciliation Center, he talked to us about the fact that in order for him to do his work as the head of the Reconciliation Center, he had to forgive all of those people who had systematically murdered almost every member of his family. And when I said to him, I don't know how you could do that, because he talked about having to forgive all of those individuals. And I said, I don't know how you could have done that. He said to me that when he forgave them, he did not realize that every morning when he gets up, he has to forgive them all over again. And that's the challenge that he faces with the work that he's doing. He believes so much in trying to bring his country back together that he has put aside his own anger and sense of victimization in order to contribute to the greater good. And while not everybody can do that, he has recognized the importance of it, not only for the country as well, but I think for himself, because he talks about how it has allowed him to move on. And so I thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, thank you, Sawbonna. That idea of seeing each other's humanity. I think Margot also alluding to many things, right? I mean, we could be talking about any kind of crisis today, and the politics, the tone, and seeing each other's humanity, and not just barking, is often better. Is better. It's not often. Let me just want to make an emphatic statement on that. Arif, you're calling us in Toronto. Go right ahead. Do you have a question, a story?
Excuse me. Sorry, yes. My name is Arif, and I was really very, very happy to see Senator Sinclair, that he is emphasizing that our energy should be focused in a positive way, which is not so much about what has been done to us and how it can be undone. But besides that, I think, or in the same vein, what I would like to ask, because I have heard from Aboriginal voices that we want to include Aboriginal elders' contribution. And the way it come across to me that as if elders are not human beings and they can only be right in every respect and we have to listen to them without questioning. So I hope if Senator Murray Sinclair could show me some insight as to what kind of caution we should exercise if somebody says.
Senator Murray? Sinclair? Yeah.
So if I understand the question, it was, what are the cautions that we need to follow when we go forward with this conversation?
About including elders' voice, exactly. That can't be also put them through the same caution or rigorous examination that we do to every human being.
And sorry, I think Arif, it's very specific. Again, it's a certain event you're holding, or in what context are you talking about?
When they say that elders should be allowed to come into the schools, for instance, and share their wisdom. My question is that everybody's wisdom, ultimately has to be judged by reason, by facts, and how it can be applicable to our current issues. But if we simply allow elders to, like one of the examples was about, this young girl who basically died because people believed that she should not be treated the scientific medicine, given the scientific medicine treatment. And she was sent to Florida, and where she ended up being treated in a way which
I guess, Arif, I'm sorry, I don't entirely understand. I'm not sure our guest does, so I'm trying to balance it out a little bit. But do you have kids in the system? Has it happened? Is it something real, like in a school that you're associated with at this point?
I have a thick file about Aboriginal issues, and I pretty much read every single article that has been written in Globe and Mail.
Okay.
And they write it a lot about it. So I have a deep interest in helping to understand how we resolve Aboriginal condition in this country.
Okay, so the most specific thing, let me put this to you, because it is an example. It's an Ontario case that he referred to. People may remember some of that clash, I guess, what's traditional, what isn't. And do you want to weigh in on that, Senator Sinclair?
Well, there were actually two cases involving two children who were whose parents decided to discontinue treatment because the children were undergoing difficulties with regard to the treatment itself. In one case, if I remember correctly, the young girl, who may have been a teenager or just about to be a teenager, had asked her parents to stop taking of her treatment because it was causing her so much pain. So they looked for an alternative way of treating her for her particular disease or illness because they felt that the way that the Western medical system was treating her was causing her too much difficulty, and so they found an alternative treatment regime. But that case turned upon the question, I think, of whether patients and parents have the right to make their own decisions around things like that. And it was not a case of she was going to be saved by the Western medical treatment. It was a case of the treatment itself was something that she particularly rejected, and so they wanted to find some other way of treating her, and they chose another way, and ultimately, of course, she lost her life. But she would have lost her life likely, according to the experts, even with Western medical treatment. So it's not that there was anything particularly wrong with what the parents did. In fact, the courts upheld the parents' right to do that. But if I understood the question, it was, and thanks for clarifying, because I think what Arif was getting to was, how do we know when elders are giving a valid opinion or wisdom, and how do we know when to accept it or not accept it? And that's a valid point. I've often said to Indigenous youth when I speak to them in schools and when I speak to their parents, is that they need to be careful about elders who say they are healers and elders who say they have knowledge, because the system of oppression that's been in place since Confederation of 150 years has resulted in a significant loss of those who actually have that knowledge, which is scientific and spiritual and emotional knowledge, and so there are many people who claim to have it who actually don't have it, and I've seen many charlatans out there taking advantage of others because they claim to be traditional healers, and I that causes me great concern. I have to say that.
Okay, and I mean, even this would be a whole other discussion, I'm sure. The word tradition, not just for Indigenous people, it can be comforting, connection through history. Sometimes it can be a prison too. So tradition is multifaceted. Martha, you're in Bruce County. Tell us about yourself and what you want to contribute to the conversation.
Ani Bojo, Margot Dick, Dijinakaz. I'm going by the name of Martha for the purpose of this phone call. Because I work in Indigenous social work, and I'm just mindful of putting my my community members in any vulnerable position. But I come from mixed heritage. I am both Eastern European Jewish and Algonquin from Quebec originally. I have no connection to my family's territory because my great-grandmother and her family were converted by Jesuits and moved from our community. And I live in a very white part of the province. I am in a secular family. My husband also comes from multiple mixed heritage. Our children are mixed heritage, but I think they strongly identify mostly as just white people, and that's fine. I feel like I live with a lot of palpable, I guess, tension because of my identity and the person that I know myself to be as part Anishinaabe. And I guess my request of you, Senator Sinclair, is if you have any insight as to what to do as a person who has identity but lives with all sorts of different kinds of violence in terms of spiritual, emotional, even employment violence in terms of the lateral violence that I experienced working within an Indigenous social work agency. And I trust your wisdom and your knowledge and your insight, and to even have the opportunity to pose that question to you is a great honor and Kachimigwech.
Senator Sinclair?
When we're growing up in this day and age, we are really challenged by the pressures that are placed upon us to come to terms with the individual histories that we carry, because there are so many within the Indigenous community who have mixed heritage, and there are teachings within many of the tribes about how that issue of mixed heritage is addressed in terms of clan memberships and in terms of family connections. And so I think becoming aware of that would probably provide some comfort. But Ultimately, the individual, I think, has to come to their own terms about that. And I think that the one thing that I've always maintained with the people that I've worked with and the people who have worked for me is that what's really important in this work that we've been doing and that we have done is to understand that, first of all, you have to take care of yourself. You have to ensure that you are in a good place and that you address the needs that you have as an individual through those whose advice you respect and whose advice you can follow and who will guide you through those very difficult moments that you're going to encounter. And then you have to take care of your family and make sure that your family is also in a very healthy position. And once you have taken care of your family, you can extend that to your community as well. But taking care of yourself and your family are first and foremost our personal obligations, and then you take care of the work that you're doing, because then you'll be able to do your work in a better way. And so I've followed that approach very carefully in the course of my lifetime, and you have to understand that I've worked in what is probably one of the most significantly challenging environments for an Indigenous person to be in, and that's in the legal community. Mm-hmm. I've worked for a system that has been the major tool of oppression in this country for Indigenous people, and yet I have worked within it feeling very comfortable about my role in it, because I've come to understand what my role is, and I've also come to appreciate what that system can do to me and can do to my family, and I have taken care of that.
Maxine, you're next. You're in Mississauga.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be able to ask this question to Senator Murray Sinclair, and I'm asking it in a very respectful way. I'm an immigrant to Canada from Britain in 1965, and my knowledge of Indigenous people has only come from my own curiosity and learning. I've read many books and tried to gain knowledge of the history and wrongs, things that have happened in Canada, which makes me slightly uncomfortable saying I love Canada, which I do, because of this uncomfortable history. But my question is really to do with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I've wondered and have not been able to find the answer as to why it was one-sided. I don't quite understand how you can have truth and reconciliation when only one people are talking, in other words, the victims, and not the people that were the directors of the schools or the teachers in the schools or the churches that were in charge of the schools at the time. Why were they not called? And will that ever happen? And would that not help First Nations people or Aboriginal people to understand when people have to stand up and say, you know, I'm sorry that I did this, or, you know, I should not have allowed myself to be part of that learning or that teaching at the time. So really that's my question, why it was a one-sided. Senator Sinclair?
That's a valid question. It's one that people ask all the time, and it's based upon, I think, an incomplete impression of what the whole process was about. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of a settlement agreement that had been reached as a result of class actions by approximately 35,000 individuals who went to the schools, who sued the government and the churches that ran the schools for the abuses that occurred. Two processes were established under the settlement agreement for the resolution of claims. One was what was called the TRC process, which was available to all of those who were in the schools, and compensation was paid merely for having been taken away from their families and placed in the schools. And opportunity was provided for them to have their stories recorded, because by virtue of the settlement agreement, they were precluded from going to court to tell their stories. invitations were extended to all of those who were still alive who worked in the schools. And keep in mind that the average age of the survivors at the time the settlement agreement was reached was in the early 60s, and the average age of those who worked in the schools would have been in the 80s. And so most of the people who worked in the schools had long since passed away. Their records, each of the churches that ran the schools kept extensive records of what those individuals did and thought about what they had done and the work that they had done. And we accessed their records and their stories through the church records and through the government archives. We had trouble getting those records, incidentally. We had to go to court a number of times to get them to hand those records over. But we also provided an opportunity for individual members who worked in the schools to come forward and tell their stories. Most declined to do so because they felt that the public process should be available for survivors. But we did arrange to interview those who wanted to talk to us, and we interviewed quite a number of former staff who worked in the schools, and their stories are all reflected in the report of the TRC.
Okay.
And if you read the report, you'll see that a number of their versions of what went on, and many of them were felt as victimized as students who went to the schools were victimized, because they had to work in substandard conditions and had to feed children bad food and had to take orders that they didn't like taking. And so those stories are all reflected in the report of the TRC.
Okay, Maxine, I'm sure she's grateful to put that to you. So many questions are coming up for me, but I do want to make space. As always, it's that tension of we run out of time. But Albert, where are you calling us from? Where are you calling us from, Albert?
Kitigan Zibi,
okay.
in Maniwaki, Quebec.
Okay, and I think you want to bring us back to sort of where we started, this discussion about Sir John A. What's his place? What's your position on him?
Well, as a long-time activist, especially a human rights activist, it really troubles me to the very core of my spirit that that anyone would be okay with the name of John A. Macdonald being attached to a school. You know, if he was a great Canadian, we'll then honor him by having statues or whatever they want on Parliament Hill. But to have his name attached to a school is offensive to me.
So
because the way I see it is that I see him as a man who, if he would have looked at a Indigenous 5-year-old child, I don't think he would have seen a human being. I'm not sure he would have even seen a child, because what he would have seen is something that needed to be stopped in its tracks. There's different ways of perpetrating genocide, and anyone that's part of genocide shouldn't be honored with their name on the school.
Senator Sinclair, Albert, stay on the line, because you're saying the opposite in a sense from the senator. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not totally opposed to what Albert's saying. I'm saying, and what I said earlier on was that putting names on buildings like schools is probably an illogical way for us to honor our heroes, and we shouldn't be doing it. We should be recognizing those schools because of the educational role that they play, and emphasizing that, and considering naming them for events in our history. They
but the butt is that you don't. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted. But the butt is that you don't like the idea of taking it off. Like, that's very negative to you.
Well, my view is no, not really. My view is if people want to take them off, then take them off, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm not arguing to keep them on. What I'm saying is that let's not waste our time only dealing with that. And I think we need to also think about, if we're going to be putting names on, then let's make sure that the names are properly
contextualized,
acknowledged. Yeah, that.
Well, I did promise
on each school where we have a name of Sir John A. Macdonald, we should have a plaque in which we talk about the context of history and talk about what he actually did. And I think by doing that, people will begin themselves to question, why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm. Do either of you have a submission of elevating someone, an Indigenous hero, that someone should know more about?
Could I just say this, that to me, anyone that had anything to do with the death of a child should not be honored with their name on a school. I'm very passionate about this because it's not just one child that died because of initiatives of John A. Macdonald. Thousands of children died, and it's totally ludicrous. I really don't comprehend it at all. It's not, my mind just doesn't understand it, that why anybody would put his name on a school.
Senator Sinclair?
I don't disagree with that. I think that we need to recognize that if we start spending our time looking at those schools with names on it of people who are responsible for the deaths of children, there are very few schools that we could probably leave untouched. I'm thinking of those children, for example, who died during the Second World War because of the atomic bombs that were used in Japan. And the presidents and the warmongers in the government of the United States who dropped that bomb. And many of them are honored in some way. And
so let's leave it on a bright note. Like, who would you like to see? Someone we should all go Google, because you're not going to be able to tell us the story in the last minute. Like, this is someone to honor, respect, learn their story.
Well, you asked me earlier if I could name two people,
yeah.
And I think I could name three. But let me say that Tecumseh is one person that we do recognize in some ways in our history, and I think he's one. But I think we should also recognize that there are heroes in West after Confederation who have contributed significantly to the development of this country, and I include Poundmaker and Big Bear among them.
Okay, and I think your list, I saw it somewhere, Elijah Harper, as you say, think of our modern characters as well. So many other questions, but listen, as always, we appreciate your time. Thank you for spending this lunch hour with us.
Thank you very much.
Senator Murray Sinclair was the Chief Commissioner for the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you want to listen again, it's cbc.ca/Ontario Today. A few links there also to send emails, which we do read. Never on the air anymore because there's always 15 other calls you would like to get on. Thank you all for your company. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.